Hello everybody and welcome to Contending Perspectives in Economics and my reading of Chapter 3. To bring you up to speed, Chapter 1 was appropriately called Introduction. Chapter 2 was Economics as a Scientific Discipline, where it went through how economists are trained and so forth. And now the chapter on Neoclassical economics. So this sort of opens here with some basic background on what Neoclassical economics is all about, how it developed, and how it became the dominant paradigm. So here we go. There are some graphs here and there. I will try to describe them so that if you do not have the book handy, then you'll have at least some sense of what's going on. Neoclassical economics. Neoclassicism is the dominant school of thought in economics. Even those attending graduate programs known for their specialization in alternative paradigms will probably find that most of their classes are taught from this perspective. Part of the reason for this is the fact that even at such institutions, it's often only a core group of faculty who are responsible for the department's non-neoclassical reputation. The majority may still be in the mainstream, and their courses are taught accordingly. Even barring that, many heterodox economists feel an obligation to cover orthodox topics, either in part or exclusively, so that their students will have sufficient background for the neoclassical courses and programs they may encounter elsewhere. Neoclassicism is also of central importance because of its role in policy. Almost every economic advisor and central banker in the world comes from this school of thought. Understanding the theory, practice, and teaching of modern economics absolutely requires understanding this school of thought. For all these reasons, it is covered first in this volume. Section 1. Foundations of Neoclassicism, Marginalism, and Scottish Common Sense Philosophy. Neoclassicism developed in the mid to late 19th century, roughly parallel to the emergence of economics as a professional academic discipline. The basic concepts, including marginal analysis, general equilibrium, rationality, price theory, and utility, were developed by a group of economists called the Marginalists. Alfred Marshall, William Stanley Jevons, Carl Menger, and Leon Walras. It is safe to say that almost everything in a modern microeconomics textbook can be traced back to or was inspired by these four scholars. One of their motivations for developing an alternate theory was the desire to resolve a puzzle left over from the work of their precursors, the classical economists, for example, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Thomas Malthus. In an oft-quoted passage, Adam Smith writes, "The word value, it is to be observed, has two different meanings and sometimes expresses the utility of some particular object and sometimes the power of purchasing other goods which the possession of that object conveys. The one may be called value in use, the other value in exchange. The things that have the greatest value in use frequently have little or no value in exchange. And on the contrary, those which have the greatest value in exchange frequently have little or no value in use. Nothing is more useful than water, but it will purchase scarce anything. Scarce anything can be had in exchange for it. A diamond, on the contrary, has scarce any value in use, but a very great quantity of other goods may be frequently had in exchange for it. This is the water-diamond paradox. Smith is asking, how can something so useful bring such a low price, while something so useless brings such a high one? The answer to this question, according to the marginalists, lies in analyzing the problem from the point of view of the marginal, or last, unit of analysis. First, consider the utility, broadly understood as happiness, you gain from the consumption of some good or service. The marginalists argued that this inevitably declines the more you consume within a given time period. The first piece of cake you eat after dinner, for example, is more satisfying than the second more than the third more than the fourth, and so on. In fact, if you continue to gorge yourself, you may soon discover that you are losing rather than gaining utility from additional units of cake. Had you been buying each piece of dessert, then it is safe to say that you would have been willing to spend less for each subsequent slice. In other words, the value of the marginal, or last, unit is declining. And therein lies the key to the paradox. Consider figure 3.1. And I'm going to show it here. If it'll focus right there, there it goes. Show it here. And now I will describe it. On the vertical axis, it has marginal utility, which is the utility of the last unit. On the horizontal axis, it has total quantity consumed, all right? And then it has two 45-degree lines negatively sloped. The innermost one is marked diamonds, and the outermost one is marked water, all right? And so this is to convey that everything else being equal, water is more valuable than diamonds. Its 45-degree line is further out, all right? And let me go back now to the discussion. Consider figure 3.1. On the vertical axis, it shows the additional utility, not total. from consuming one more unit of the good in question, and it assumes that this declines and can even become negative. That's why the 45-degree line is negative. The last unit, as you consume more, which moves you to the right on the horizontal axis, so you move down on the vertical axis, the utility from the last one, and it goes through the horizontal line because it can actually become negative, the amount of utility you get as you gorge yourself on cake, etc. The units of measure are irrelevant so long as it is made clear that water is, everything else being equal, more useful to us than diamonds. This is why the line for water is higher everywhere than that for diamonds, which is consistent with Smith's statement regarding the value and use above. However, everything else is not equal, for the relative scarcity of the two products is such that the average consumer is able to enjoy Q sub 2 units of water, but only Q sub 1 units of diamonds. And I think probably clear to you is that Q sub 2 is more than Q sub 1. This leaves the marginal utility of water at Mu sub 2 and that of diamonds at Mu sub 1. So, hence, while water is generally more useful than diamonds, its value in exchange is far lower because of what you are willing to pay is a function of how anxious you are to acquire the next unit. And you already have lots of water to start with, right? So, water is overall more useful, but because we have so much more of it than we do of diamonds, the marginal utility of a diamond is higher than the marginal utility of water. The amount you would pay for one more diamond is much more than the amount you would pay for one more water. Note the importance in this analysis of assuming that agents are capable of clearly recognizing the course of action that best satisfies them and then selecting it. If this were not true, then this analysis may show how people should act, but not necessarily how they do act. That is, it would be prescriptive and not descriptive. However, another core concept in neoclassicism is that agents are quote-unquote rational, by which they mean that people are indeed able to recognize and choose the best option. This is a major theme throughout their work. Marginal analysis was applied to a number of areas in economics, including but not limited to firm behavior, consumer behavior, and price theory. It is noteworthy that during this period, economists were largely discussing these issues among themselves. This is not to say that there was not some participation from those in business and government, but this was diminishing as compared to during the classical period. As economics became an academic discipline unto itself, the primary audience became other economists. This was one, but not the only, reason for the shift from policy to more abstract and technical subjects. Another significant development during this period was general equilibrium analysis. First explored by marginalist Léon Walras, it is a framework in which all variables are mutually dependent, remain at rest until exogenous forces create a disturbance, and exist in a timeless world. What this means is that economic systems seek resting points in the same way that objects do in Newtonian physics. The standard supply and demand diagram illustrates just such a situation. Once we are at the equilibrium price and quantity, nothing will ever change again unless we shift one of the curves. Furthermore, the variables in a general equilibrium model are mutually dependent. To borrow an analogy from Alfred Marshall, imagine 3 balls resting in a bowl. Removing any one, which is akin to an exogenous force, will cause the other 2 to move in response. However, they will quickly achieve a new equilibrium position and remain there until another ball is removed or added. Extending this concept to the economy, the idea is that all prices and quantities in every market are dependent upon each other and that a single equilibrium position exists among them. Moving one price or quantity necessitates the adjustment of the others. Last, this is a timeless analysis because if one were shown a series of photographs of the bowl with various numbers of balls in it, it would be impossible to determine which happened first, second, third, and so on. In this approach, the past has no qualitative effect on the future. Strictly speaking, time does not matter in the sense that there is no logical order to a set of equilibrium points. Generally speaking, the marginalists approached questions of economic theory with the belief that they were describing natural rather than social behavior. This can be traced back to classical economists and Adam Smith, whose work emerged during a part of the Enlightenment when scholars were focusing on explaining what they thought to be natural human rights and proclivities. Hence, these economists saw themselves as offering universal principles of economic behavior, not simply those of 19th century Western Europeans. In addition, they had a strong preference for a priori theorizing. To understand what this means, consider the structure of an argument. It consists of a series of premises that lead to a conclusion. For example, premise 1, all economists are risk-averse. Premise 2, Susan is an economist. Therefore, Susan is risk-averse. Two important properties of arguments are validity and cogency. The former requires that the conclusion is supported by the premises. This is clearly true above. If all economists are risk-averse and Susan is an economist, then she too must be risk-averse. Cogency, however, requires both validity and that the premises be warranted. Thus, we must know if, quote, all economists are risk-averse, unquote, and, quote, Susan is an economist, unquote, are reasonable statements. Unfortunately, while determining validity is a relatively objective process, warranted is much more subjective. This is particularly true when we were talking about modeling complex phenomena, where it is absolutely necessary to simplify the object of our study. Is saying that firms are short-term profit maximizers a fatal oversimplification or close enough for present purposes? This is a difficult question to resolve, especially because the answer could be yes in one context and no in another, even within the same school of thought, depending on the goal and scope of the study in question. No wonder economists disagree. One of the issues in considering whether or not the premises are warranted is a philosophical or a methodological one. What is the proper means of developing premises? In the above argument, with all economists are risk-averse and Susan is an economist and so on, is it more reliable to conduct empirical research to discover economists' attitudes towards risk, via survey or controlled experiments perhaps? Or is it actually better to rely on one's own abstract reasoning and intuition, as in, it seems logical to me that economists would be risk-averse? The marginalists inherited from the classicals the belief that it was the latter. Their argument, based on Scottish common-sense philosophy, was that it was too easy for a researcher to bias premises from observation because the latter is strongly affected by what we expect to see. The world is not full of facts waiting for us to discover them. Rather, we build science on our interpretations of data, interpretations inevitably affected by our preconceptions. Hence, you may end up inadvertently proving whatever you thought was suspected in the first place. For that reason, the marginalists argued that we should build premises based on introspection and make them so self-evident as to be beyond question. This requires that we build economic arguments by starting with axiomatic first principles, or a priori premises, based on abstract reasoning rather than observation. All right. Section 2, the rise to prominence of neoclassicism. At the core of neoclassical theory are marginal analysis, the rationality assumption, general equilibrium modeling, and a priorism, which I just covered in the previous section. However, as will be discussed later in the chapter, this school of thought is so large and varied that it is impossible to point to a single set of contemporary theories associated with these ideas. Indeed, the range is such that there are acrimonious fights within neoclassicism and between subgroups that would vehemently deny being members of the same school of thought. Neoclassical Keynesians and monetarists, for example. Nevertheless, because their disagreements are a question of the means of application of a common set of principles, rather than a rejection of them, they will all be treated as neoclassical here. Neoclassicism did not always enjoy the monopoly it does now. This did not emerge until after the Second World War. Before that, institutionalists, Austrians, and those who would later be called post-Keynesians were active participants along with neoclassicals in, quote, mainstream, unquote, economic discussions. A number of things occurred to change this situation, and in the process, the nature of neoclassicism evolved too. The importance of these events goes well beyond this chapter, of course, and relates to the very raison d'etre of this book. The key question is, did neoclassicism become dominant because economists carefully considered all the alternatives and found it to offer superior explanations of the phenomena we study? If so, this volume is unnecessary. If not, then perhaps the relegation of non-neoclassical theory to history of economic thought class has been premature. The first important event that took place was related to the utility of many neoclassical tools during the Second World War. Marginal analysis proved to be very useful in solving allocation and maximization problems under the conditions of full employment that the conflict created. To understand this, take the production possibility frontier shown in figure 3.2, and this one's very simple. The vertical axis says automobiles produced. The horizontal axis says rice produced, and then there is a curve going from intersecting the vertical axis at a point well above the origin to intersecting the horizontal axis at a point well above the origin. It's drawn curved, but that doesn't make a difference here. If you picture it as a 45-degree line, negatively sloped, intersecting each axis, then that will work just fine. And then it has 3 points on it. A, impossible, which is to the right of this line. C, efficient, which is on the line, and B, inefficient, which is inside the line. And this will all be described here in a moment. Anyway, this diagram can be used to illustrate the social costs of allocating scarce resources to various types of production. Labeled on each axis is a particular good that could be produced using available resources, in this case automobiles or rice. Combinations outside the curve are impossible to achieve because we have insufficient resources to do so. Those inside the curve represent inefficient choices because they leave resources idle, and those on the perimeter are efficient choices because they employ all available resources. It is assumed in this analysis that economies will come to rest somewhere on the curve, or the line if you're picturing it that way. More on why this is true later. The choice of the exact position being the open question. Meanwhile, the production possibility frontier analysis defines the trade-offs they make in making their selection. These are expressed in terms of opportunity costs, or what must be foregone in terms of the other good. This is consistent with their overall approach, measured at the margin. For example, say we are currently at point C, but want to build a new car. Point C was on the line / on the curve. So I'll read that again. For example, say that we are currently at point C, but want to build one more car. The slope of the line shows how much rice must be sacrificed to do so. Note that this varies along the curve, if you've drawn it as a curve, not as a straight line. And it's not really important to the argument here. With the opportunity cost of automobiles rising as we produce more and more of them, this is because resources are not equally suited to each type of production. Rice is easier to grow in wet, swampy climates, while you need to build an automobile factory on dry, solid ground. As we shift towards cars, we take out of rice production resources that were poorly suited to making the latter in the first place. Hence, the opportunity cost is relatively low. But if we continue on this course, we eventually end up using labor, capital, and raw materials that would have been better suited for rice. The opportunity cost becomes very high. Again, not central to the argument here, but it's explaining how the curved line shows a more realistic scenario in the sense that the opportunity cost changes along the curve. If you're already producing tons and tons of cars and you want to make more, well, then you're probably pulling out of production rice paddies that were really good for rice paddies and not really good for automobile factories. But note that in order for the cost to be measured in this way, we must be on the curve itself. That's the key point, and it makes no difference whether it's a curved line or a straight one. We cannot be beyond it, for that is impossible. And inside the perimeter, one can have more of one good without giving up any of the other. Opportunity cost would not exist. And therein lies a key issue. This tool, designed to offer insights regarding trade-offs under full employment, is not very useful outside that context. And the Great Depression was well outside. The problem during the 1930s was not the allocation of scarce resources, but the desperate need to find employment for an abundant one, labor. So long as there were unemployed citizens willing to work at the current wage, we were at a point analogous to B and could produce more without giving anything up, again, inside the curve. The marginal analysis of neoclassicism does not help with this. And while it may be possible to look back and identify economists who offered useful contemporary analyses, in general, the reputation of our profession suffered from its apparent inability to explain the greatest crisis capitalism had ever faced. The Second World War, however, brought high levels of output and full employment. Suddenly, questions of opportunity costs and trade-offs were on the forefront, and neoclassicism was well placed to provide answers. Tools based on the same concepts as illustrated in the production possibility frontier were employed with great success and in contexts well beyond the economy. Particularly in contrast to the struggles economists faced in trying to end the Depression, this had the effect of raising the prestige of neoclassical economics. Probably even more important to the ascension of neoclassicism, however, was what happened after the defeat of Germany and Japan. Tensions were very high in what was perceived to be a life-or-death struggle with the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, and the Cold War fueled a real and significant antagonism toward any analysis that did not argue that capitalism was best. Economics professors, among others, thought to be sympathetic to the enemies of Western democracy could face serious sanctions from their university, funding agencies, the government, private sector interests, and so on. It may be somewhat difficult to imagine such a repressive environment today, depending on where you live, of course. It was not simply a matter of subtle pressure or mild suggestions. Rather, and this is a quote here from author Clark, mandatory loyalty oaths and political purges of the faculties became all too common in universities across the nation. And even on those campuses that were spared the most egregious academic atrocities, the insidious influence of McCarthyism caused administrators to become timid in their defense of academic freedom and the faculty to engage in self-censorship as a mode of survival. Universities were a particular focus because there was widespread concern that communists were infiltrating education and indoctrinating young people. As evidence of the perceived seriousness of the threat, a vote in the House of Representatives to allocate funds for the, quote, hunt for communism in schools, unquote, in 1953 passed 315 to 2. Although outside of economics per se, this extended passage from the 1953 Congressional Quarterly Almanac may drive home the pervasiveness and character of the anti-communist campaign. Harry D. Giudice, president of Brooklyn College, testified on March 11 that communism was, quote, on the run, unquote, because, quote, with young people, it is losing its appeal with astounding rapidity. Dr. Giudice said the Senate inquiry has enabled Brooklyn College to rid itself of 7 allegedly communist faculty members, 6 of whom refused to answer Senate queries about communism, and a 7th who resigned before appearing at Senate committee hearings. On March 19, Richard E. Combs said that more than 100 teachers had been dismissed and another 100 blocked from employment as teachers in California colleges because of communist affiliations. He was chief counsel of the California Senate Committee on Un-American Activities, which, he said, checked on faculty members and then turned over any derogatory information to the college presidents for action. These teachers, March 24, refused, on grounds of possible self-incrimination, to say whether they had ever been communists. They were Paul Harvey Aaron of Sarah College, Bronxville, New York, Dr. Doxy Wilkerson of New York City, and Mrs. Grace Gilbert Smith, a nursery school teacher in New York. That the last was a nursery school teacher may suggest the vigor with which this was pursued. Nor did one actually have to be a communist, of course. Refusing to testify on principle or constitutional grounds was sufficient to end a career, as was simply being accused. And as an editorial in the Harvard Crimson lamented, the effects go far beyond those directly attacked. So this is from the Harvard Crimson. What must be remembered, though, is that even though a healthy attitude for controversy and research still exists at most universities, this does not mean that academic freedom has not already been limited. Freedom dies piecemeal. For every violation that comes to light, there are scores of actions that were self-repressed, meetings that were never held, research conclusion never expressed, political activity never taken up, humanitarian cause that failed because teachers were afraid to sign their names to anything. The political stagnation on American campuses is as much a testimony to the decay of academic freedom as any fired professor or loyalty oath. Needless to say, this created a toxic atmosphere for academic economists as well. The safest were those in schools of thought whose analyses leaned more pro-market. And while neoclassicism did not blindly support capitalism, its conclusions were definitely more friendly to free markets than those of institutionalism and followers of Keynes and certainly Marxism. Hence, this meant that the neoclassical economists were favored in hiring, promotion, funding, and so on, and much less likely to be subpoenaed by the House Un-American Activities Committee. In addition, because there was little to be gained from inviting the scrutiny of those searching for subversives, economists of all varieties, including neoclassicals, had an incentive to make their work less accessible to those outside the discipline. Economic research became less policy-oriented, instead more mathematical, abstract, and theoretical. So while the success of the technical tools used during the Second World War and the continued professionalization of the discipline no doubt played a role, the external pressures created by the social and political forces described here were decisive. Added to this is what Jeff Hodgson identifies as commercialization within education, which, now this is from Jeff Hodgson, eroded enclaves of broad liberal education, vastly expanded professional training oriented towards employment, led to requirements to account for the economic value of university research, and promoted the increasing use of league tables and formalized research assessments to pressure academics to publish their research. End quote. The socio-political factors especially served not only to muffle several voices that had been active in pre-war scholarly debate, but created a strong us versus them environment in which issues were viewed in black and white and everyone was seen as either a good guy or a bad guy. It was also in this atmosphere that the conceptual distinction between so-called fact-based positive economics and opinion-based normative economics became popular, though it had existed before. Good economists preferred the former, i.e. the positive economics, the fact-based, and left the latter to the public or politicians for their own speculative and simplistic popular writings. Venturing into normative economics was permitted, but potentially dangerous, as it left you open to politically based attacks and was viewed as less scientific. Hence the popularity of framing your research as positive. I'm only explaining the facts. Neoclassicism thus emerged from this period as the dominant paradigm. Note that this discussion is not meant to be an indictment of that school of thought, however. One of the core themes of this book is that there are interesting and useful concepts to be found in every approach, not to be confused with the idea that they're all correct. What I do mean to point out, though, is that there was no discipline-wide debate that left neoclassicism the winner, Nor was there an insidious plot by neoclassicals to take over economics and intentionally reduce the roles played by other schools of thought. Rather, economics is a subculture, embedded within a larger culture, and pressures from the latter were decisive in creating the situation that exists today. Unfortunately, at least from the perspective of this book, the collapse of the Soviet Union did not reverse this process and return us to a point of open exchange among diverse scientific positions, although movements supporting such an outcome do exist and appear to be gaining some momentum. Instead, once established, neoclassicism's monopoly position created numerous barriers to entry to alternate approaches that did not fall along with the Berlin Wall. One of the most important residual barriers to pluralism is that related to publication. Recall the discussion from Chapter 2 regarding the means by which economists are trained, promoted, and rewarded. Central to the last two is the journal system wherein rankings play a key role in determining the credit a professor earns for a particular publication. As a result of the events discussed above, the list that we inherited from the 20th century puts neoclassical journals squarely at the top, indeed on essentially the entire list. The reward system thus continues to be heavily weighted against those pursuing other approaches. As a consequence, they are often relegated to smaller institutions where research is not as highly valued and the opportunity to train PhDs is extremely limited. This both retards the further development of the school of thought in question and creates a significant obstacle to the training of new generations of economists. The situation is such that, generally speaking, most economists are rarely aware of that communities of scholars outside of neoclassicism even exist. Let me repeat that. It is not that neoclassical economists have heard all the alternatives and made their choice. Rather, they generally have little idea that alternatives are even out there, and certainly little idea of how they work. A major purpose of this book is to help reverse this trend. Okay, new section, the full employment assumption. It was mentioned above that one of the primary foci of neoclassical economics is constrained optimization, or choosing among alternatives in the face of trade-offs. However, it was also suggested that if we are at less than full employment, opportunity costs do not exist, and this type of analysis is no longer helpful. Despite the obvious limitations this could create, neoclassicals do not view it as a serious issue because they believe the economy automatically tends towards full employment. This is true even of the more interventionist members of this school of thought. Take, for example, this quote from Christina Romer, one-time head of Barack Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, and here's her quote. The prevailing view among economists is that there is a level of economic activity, often referred to as full employment, at which the economy could stay forever. Romer believes this, despite the fact that she is one of those who would argue that we can and should help the economy if it falls below full employment. But we're only helping. It's fixing itself anyway. At the other end of the spectrum within neoclassicism are those who not only believe this is true, but argue that any attempt by government policymakers to speed the process is doomed to failure. The economy works best when left alone. In either event, however, the end result is still the same. Full employment is guaranteed. If not continually, then eventually. It is the state towards which we are always working, like one of those children's punching bags with sand in the bottom. They may be temporarily fall off to one side, but they are constantly trying to right themselves. For this reason, neoclassicals sometimes frame their analyses as being more appropriate to the long run than the short run. In other words, while we may be inside the production possibilities curve right now, we can nevertheless employ tools based on opportunity cost trade-offs because eventually we'll be back on the frontier. That is the natural position of the economy. Now, there are a variety of explanations regarding how self-correction occurs, each focusing on a different aspect of the process. I will focus on the loanable funds theory of interest, as it offers insights into their view of the macroeconomy in general, and it will be a useful reference in later chapters. Start with the simple economy, wherein there is no government or foreign sector, only domestic firms and households. Say Y represents total output. Note that it must be logically true that this also be equal to total income and total expenditure. This is always true in a closed system because every time you make an expenditure, it is necessarily for something, that is output, and it becomes someone else's income. For example, if you decide to get a $5 hamburger for lunch, you make a $5 expenditure for a $5 unit of output, and the vendor earns $5 in income. One transaction generates three identical values, which is why total expenditures necessarily equal total output, which equals total income. All right, further assume that only households earn income, that is, firms do not retain any profits, they pay them all out, and that they spend it either on consumption, which is the letter C, or they save it, which is the letter S. Meanwhile, firms undertake physical investment or additions to their ability to produce output, new factories, for example. And since they have no income, they must borrow to do so. This means that in terms of expenditures, only two things can be purchased in the simple economy: consumer goods or investment goods. Note that it's unnecessary to take separate account of the raw materials firms use to make the consumer and investment goods they sell, because those costs are already included in the price of the final product. For instance, in the hamburger example above, the vendor already included the labor, hamburger meat, bun, lettuce, tomato, ketchup, and so on. The sale price is equal to those costs plus profit. If we valued national output by counting both the final price of the hamburger and the raw materials, we'd be counting the same values multiple times. All right, a very important conclusion from comparing equations 3.1 and 3.2, and let me describe those. 3.1 was y equals c plus s, which is income is equal to consumption plus savings, because there's only two things you can do with income. You can either consume or you can save. Equation 3.2 was y equals c plus I. Now we're thinking of expenditures. There's only two possible kinds of expenditures: expenditures for consumer goods or expenditures for investment goods, right? So y equals c plus s, y equals c plus I. There's an important conclusion from comparing those two equations, and that it must be true that I equals S. In other words, in equilibrium, total savings must equal total investment. That this is true under the assumptions made above is not controversial, all right? So nobody disagrees about that part. There are, however, strong disagreements regarding the process by which that equality is maintained. The loanable funds theory of interest argues that interest rates play the key role. In fact, not only do they keep investment equal to savings, but they are also what creates a strong tendency towards full employment. To understand this, first return to the household. How do they decide how much to spend versus save? In the neoclassical framework, this is determined by the rate of interest. Households would rather, they assume, spend all their money on consumption goods today. The only thing that convinces them not to is the offer of interest from banks. The more banks offer, the more households will save for tomorrow. So there's a positive relationship between savings and the interest rate. Meanwhile, a key determinant of firms' investment is also the current rate of interest, but since they have no income and are forced to borrow to finance any projects, it has a negative impact. So the higher the interest rate, the lower the level of investment. Last, banks pay interest to the households on their savings and earn it from firms on investment. Now consider the following scenario. Let's say we start at savings equals investment with the economy at full employment. Everything is great, and we're on the outer perimeter of the production possibilities frontier. What would happen if firms decided to reduce investment? This could potentially cause recession, as spending declines and workers find themselves unemployed. However, while this may occur as the economy adjusts, it does not represent the new equilibrium position. This is so because a problem has been created for banks. They are still paying interest on the same volume of saving, but the fall in firm borrowing to invest means that banks' revenues have declined. They now have unborrowed savings in their vaults. They can address this, though, by lowering interest rates. According to equations 3.1 and 3.2, this will have the effect of reducing savings while raising investment. How much will they lower the interest rate? Enough to ensure that all the savings are once again borrowed, which occurs at S equals I. This, then, is the process by which the equality of S and I is maintained. But there's more. Say that we had started at S equals I equals $500, which by our assumptions above must be consistent with full employment, and that the initial decline in I left it at $400. As banks lowered R in response, I would start to rise back above 400, and S would fall below 500. For sake of argument, say that the new equilibrium is S equals I equals 450. The net fall in investment was therefore $50, and so overall investment demand has declined by that amount. This would leave us at less than full employment. However, if savings also fell by $50, this means that consumption must have risen by the same amount. The net fall in investment is exactly offset by the rise in consumption. When modeled more formally, it can be shown that this is precisely what happens in every scenario, leading to the general conclusion that whenever demand falls and threatens recession, interest rates will adjust in a manner that reinvigorates spending just enough to keep it at full employment. This is the manner by which the economy automatically self-corrects and returns us to full employment, thereby allowing the use of the opportunity cost-based analyses. Interest rates are, incidentally, viewed as important variables in the macroeconomy in general, and not just in this context. For example, it is seen as a common culprit in the onset of recession. The theory is that in late expansion, central banks start to worry about inflation and therefore raise interest rates. This will cause a fall in investment and overall spending, bringing on the downturn. Rudiger Dornbusch, who is a very famous neoclassical economist, writes that, quote, "None of the U.S. expansions in the last 40 years died in bed of old age. Everyone was murdered by the Federal Reserve," unquote. Another example of the importance of interest rates in this school of thought is the common recommendation among neoclassicals that nations should increase their savings rates. This is so because it would cause savings to go up and be larger than investment, which would encourage banks to lower interest rates and thereby encourage investment. While this would not cause a change in overall employment, since it just means from moving from one full employment position to another, it would nevertheless raise long-term growth, as the higher level of investment would raise productivity in the future. Next section, modern mainstream economics. Is mainstream economics actually still neoclassical? Largely yes, but there are open questions and gray areas. Some authors have argued that the mainstream is undergoing a fundamental transformation, that it is, quote, moving away from a strict adherence to the Holy Trinity, rationality, selfishness, and equilibrium, to a more eclectic position of purposeful behavior, enlightened self-interest, and sustainability, unquote. In particular, they believe that, so these people that believe that neoclassical economics is no longer just neoclassical, they believe that, 1, evolutionary game theory is redefining how institutions are integrated into the analysis. 2, ecological economics is redefining how nature and the economy are viewed as interrelating. 3, psychological economics is redefining how rationality is treated. 4, econometric work dealing with the limitations of classical statistics is redefining how economists think of empirical proof. 5, complexity theory is offering a way of redefining how we conceive of general equilibrium. 6, computer simulations are offering a way of redefining models and how they are used. And 7, experimental economics is changing the way economists think about empirical work. That said, they also admit that this is occurring only at the edges of the discipline and that broader acceptance is not a given. This is particularly true in the classroom where, quote, textbooks, especially lower-level texts, do not reflect the diversity of views acceptable to the mainstream, but instead reflect an older orthodox position, unquote. Others are not convinced that this shift is truly underway. Instead, they say that what's actually occurring is that the items on the list above are simply being harvested for those elements that can be integrated into the existing neoclassical research agenda. Anything that does not fit is ignored. Furthermore, many of these innovative ideas are actually not new to anyone but those in mainstream economics. Other schools of thought and social sciences have been using them for a long time. Is there really a mini revolution going on such that neoclassical and mainstream are becoming increasingly less synonymous? It is obviously difficult to say while these events are still emerging and developing. Perhaps it will be more clear in 20 or 30 years when the current generation of senior economists has retired. Even then, however, the other problem is that this is occurring in a very large group, quite possibly larger than all the other schools of thought in this book combined. Hence, a subset of mainstream economists doing a particular kind of work might still outnumber all the institutionalists in Chapter 7. This makes evaluating their impact even more problematic. One thing that does appear to be true is that many of those with fresh PhDs are more interested in empirical techniques than theory. The computing power we have today, combined with the massive data sets created by our digital age, offer tremendous opportunities to discover empirical regularities if one knows how. This apparent jettisoning of the straitjacket of theory in favor of just seeing what the numbers tell us may sound encouraging to those arguing for a more pluralistic approach in our discipline. It would suggest that one could do work from any one of the perspectives outlined in this volume without being negatively impacted. Indeed, this is just what those cited above believe that the discipline is undergoing right now. However, just because you do not openly acknowledge the underlying theory driving your research does not mean that it is absent. It cannot be, for there exists an infinite variety of phenomena in the universe. On which set do you focus your study of the determinants of involuntary unemployment? And what made you think that involuntary unemployment was even worth studying? These are questions of theory, of which variables are important, and of the nature of their interactions. You cannot have empirics without theory, because you cannot specify an empirical test without considering these issues. To repeat the Einstein quote from the last chapter, whether you can observe a thing or not depends on the theory which you use. What this focus on empiricism suggests instead is that those involved simply have not given it much thought, which is not good. I would contend that they are operating on the assumption that the theory implicit in what they have learned in graduate school, which remains some form of neoclassicism, is simply the common, undisputed framework that all economists use. Hence, since we all agree on this unstated set of assumptions, concepts, and practices, it's just economics, and not some variety thereof. It is in that sense that they view their work as atheoretical, but of course it is not. And if dissertation and tenure committees and journal editors share this view, that there are consequences to doing even empirical research from non-neoclassical perspectives, it would be very difficult to get even a sophisticated, cutting-edge Marxist statistical paper on the secularly declining rate of profit published in a mainstream journal. Even without the word Marx anywhere, it would hit a serious roadblock as the editor and viewers wondered, why on earth is this an important issue? And what the heck is surplus value? All empirical work is undertaken in the context of theory. It is a serious error not to acknowledge and carefully consider this. Another trend that has emerged in mainstream economics is the disparagement of their own macro theory. David Colander finds evidence of this in his survey of graduate students at top PhD programs. Here, this is a quote from that article. In the interviews, macro received highly negative marks across schools. A typical comment was the following, quote, the general perspective of the micro students is that macro courses are pretty worthless and that we don't see why we have to do it, because we don't see that what is taught is a plausible description of the economy. It's not that macroeconomic questions are inherently uninteresting. It's just that the models presented in the courses are not up to the job of explaining what is happening. There is just a lot of math and we can't see the purpose of it, unquote. The discipline's failure to predict the financial crisis did not help mainstream macro's reputation, nor did the 2018 Nobel laureate Paul Romer's widely publicized comments. This is from Paul Romer. In the last 3 decades, the methods and conclusions of macroeconomics have deteriorated to the point that much of the work in this area no longer qualifies as scientific research. The larger concern is that macroeconomic pseudoscience is undermining the norms of science throughout economics. If so, all the policy domains that economics touches can lose the accumulation of useful knowledge that characteristic of true science, the greatest human invention. Romer labeled today's work as post-real, or in a state where no one really cares that the models have any connection to reality. He received a great deal of pushback from those he was criticizing, but also a great deal of support. His view of why this state of affairs has emerged is particularly interesting given the theme of this volume, and this is also from Romer. My conjecture is that string theory and post-real macroeconomics illustrate a general failure mode of a scientific field that relies on mathematical theory. The conditions for failure are present when a few talented researchers come to be respected for genuine contributions on the cutting edge of mathematical modeling. Admiration evolves into a deference to these leaders. Deference leads to effort along specific lines that the leaders recommend. Because guidance from authority can coordinate the efforts of other researchers, conformity to the facts is no longer needed as a coordinating device. As a result, if facts disconfirm the officially sanctioned theoretical vision, they are subordinated. Eventually, evidence stops being relevant. Progress in the field is judged by the purity of its mathematical theories as determined by the authorities. Consistent with the highlighted sentence above, which was the sentence that said, admiration evolves into deference to these leaders. Romer reported that a great deal of criticism that he received was along the lines of, quote, how dare you say something negative about Professor so-and-so, unquote, and not something substantive regarding his argument. To be fair, every school of thought engages in this sort of ancestor worship to some extent. Romer, however, sees it as having been decisive in the alleged decline of mainstream/neoclassical macroeconomics. Note that the rest of this chapter focuses more narrowly on neoclassical economics and leaves aside the still open question of whether or not the mainstream is drifting away from this. So now we have a section here that is copied in every subsequent chapter. For every school of thought, there is a general description such as I just gave, but it will vary, the topics will vary depending on what is important in that school of thought. But then every chapter will then close with method, views of human nature and justice, standards, contemporary activities, criticisms, final rejoinder, and further reading. So every chapter will have that. So now we'll go on with method. Neoclassical economists, like the marginalists, tend to focus their studies on the behavior of the individual. It is their belief that economics done properly starts at the level of the representative agent. This is so because social forces are seen as, if not totally unimportant, at least secondary. Economic behavior is law-like and universal in the sense that a model that applies to the 20th century Germans also explains 21st century Koreans, 20th century Chileans, 2nd century Romans, and so on. It is in that sense akin to human physiology. If we know how humans digest food today, then we know how they digest food everywhere across time and space. Examinations of history and institutions are of only minor interest. Such an approach puts microeconomics at the core of the neoclassical research agenda, for it is at this level at which they believe behavior truly reveals itself. Hence, macroeconomics should have micro foundations, or a clear exposition of how individuals in the model behave. As has already been explained, they view economic agents as being rational, self-interested, and focused on decision-making at the margin. What has not been mentioned so far is that neoclassicals do not believe that it is strictly necessary for people to actually be rational, self-interested, and decision-makers at the margin, only that they act as if they were rational, self-interested, and decision-makers at the margin. This as-if method is important and shows up at a number of levels. For instance, in the methodological belief that it is more important to build models that accurately predict behavior than accurately describe it. Take the theory that businesses calculate marginal revenue and marginal cost curves in order to determine where to set price, which is something you may have learned in a micro class at some point, but if not, don't worry about it. In point of fact, it is very unlikely that they could do this even if they wanted to, as the necessary information is rarely available. However, neoclassicals, assuming that this is what they do, even if it turns out that they do not, nevertheless generate a model that accurately predicts the real world. So in other words, even if they don't consciously act that way, they act as if they're thinking that way, and so our model is accurate. On that basis, they argue it is a useful model. A parallel would be making predictions under the assumption that Isaac Newton was correct, that time and space are constants, even though modern physicists broadly reject the view in favor of Albert Einstein's relativity. Yet, for 99.9% of the phenomena we observe, Newtonian premises generate accurate predictions. It is more important that our assumptions create reliable forecasts than accurately reflect the underlying behavior. This position is consistent with the foundation in Scottish common sense philosophy mentioned earlier. If we develop first principles by asking managers how they set price or observing their behavior, then we are likely to contaminate our data with our own preconceptions. Your senses cannot be trusted. Better to begin by laying out premises based on our carefully considered abstract reasoning, even if it generates assumptions that may otherwise seem questionable. Thus, the fact that the typical neoclassical microeconomics class says very little about what happens in day-to-day operations of real-world businesses is not considered a weakness. Rather, it is a function of their view that the correct manner in which to understand economic behavior. In addition, phenomena are usually placed within an equilibrium framework, and analyses focus on the marginal unit. All right, views of human nature and justice. Humans, as suggested above, are viewed as individualistic, at least with respect to the subject of our discipline. Religion, kinship patterns, language, and so on may vary from culture to culture, but economic behavior is universal. Neoclassicals believe that one of our tasks as economists is to identify those laws. Adam Smith said, for example, that humans naturally want to truck, barter, and trade, and that they are self-interested. This is not meant as a description of 18th century Scots, but of all people everywhere and throughout history. In terms of justice, neoclassicals believe that the goal of our policy should be to ensure consumer sovereignty in the market. What this means is that they want consumers to be the ones who are really in charge of what gets produced. On the surface, it may appear that firms are making these decisions, but in a truly competitive market, they are simply reacting to consumers' demands. Thus, the consumers are the sovereigns. Neoclassicals also believe that the profits and wages earned in a competitive market are objective reflections of the true value of those agents' contributions. Any income disparities, regardless of size, are not only fair, but they are to be encouraged, since these were ultimately created not by the individuals in question, but by consumers. Redistributing income would only serve to skew production away from those consumer preferences. Now the section on standards. And if you recall from the previous chapter, the argument was that what people say and what they do are not the same thing. There are many unwritten rules, right? And there are primary rules of behavior that if you violate these, then you're kicked out of our group. And then there are secondary ones where you just better be careful. So, standards, primary. One of the core concepts in neoclassicism is the rationality of all individuals. This is taken to be axiomatic. Of course people know what will please them most, and of course they will select the courses of action that lead to these outcomes. In addition, these preferences are internal and independent of others. All this is consistent with the belief that economic behavior in general is natural and not cultural. Humans are also assumed to be instinctively drawn toward market-based solutions. This rooting of the basics of economic behavior in the individual means that even macro theories in neoclassicism must have micro foundations. Another primary standard is the assumption that economic processes tend toward equilibrium. In this context, the specific resting point toward which macroeconomies automatically move is one consistent with full employment. There are neoclassical models that allow for less than full employment, but they do so by assuming some friction or interference with the market process. Otherwise, as indicated by the Christina Romer quote above, they believe that we would stay at full employment forever. Secondary. On the other hand, while neoclassicals mistrust observational data like surveys, this is not a hard and fast rule, as these have been employed extensively in exchange rate research where their traditional methods have had difficulty. Still, one is expected to offer a justification. In addition, research focusing on specific nations or cultures is not typical because economic behavior is seen as natural. But it is generally acceptable if an argument can be made that it is consistent with the underlying theory. In fact, this is true of a wide variety of subjects that might not otherwise be considered economics per se. If elements of the traditional economic model can be applied, then the topic is fair game. Likewise, government intervention is generally viewed as undesirable, but if it can be shown that there are unavoidable frictions or that market failure, a situation wherein the market is unable to supply a good in the quantity that society would desire, then it is justifiable. Contemporary activities. As neoclassicism is the dominant school of thought, it would almost be easier to point out which journals, associations, and conferences were not organized by them. In the United States, the primary organization is the American Economic Association. Founded in 1885, their webpage lists its stated purposes as 1. The encouragement of economic research, especially the historical and statistical study of the actual conditions of industrial life. 2. The issue of publications on economic subjects. 3. The encouragement of perfect freedom of economic discussion. The association as such will take no partisan attitude, nor will it commit its members to any position on practical economic questions. End of the list there. It holds one major conference every year in early January, timed to fall between the fall and spring semesters of most universities. The meeting is important beyond the papers being presented and the social gatherings hosted, for it is also the focus of the job market for PhD economists. Employers, especially but not exclusively academic ones, submit information to Job Openings for Economists, an American Economic Association database. Well before the conference, candidates who are often soon to be PhDs search this site for positions that match their qualifications. They submit the requested materials and hope they are contacted. Meanwhile, employers sift through what are often very many curriculum vitae, research papers, and so on, and prepare a list of potential employees to interview. As suggested above, the latter takes place at the annual convention. Favorite candidates are typically invited to campus for more in-depth interviewing. Actually, since COVID, a lot of it takes place on Zoom, but you still invite people to campus. I mention all this to emphasize the critical importance of this conference. The overwhelming majority of universities hire new faculty via this process. In addition, universities have limited travel money. Therefore, an Austrian economist hoping to attend the Austrian Economics Research Conference might be forced instead to spend travel money to go to the American Economics Association meetings in order to participate in the interviewing. Some schools of thought are lucky in that the American Economics Association meetings include special sessions from their perspective, but these are invariably a sideshow, and the space allotted to them has been reduced over the years. The point here is that this represents yet another obstacle to a pluralistic approach to economics. It is very difficult for other schools of thought to grow and prosper. This is not, however, to repeat a point made above, an indictment of neoclassicism per se. Had any other school of thought ended up in such a monopolistic position, it would have created an environment like this. All right, criticisms. It is difficult to summarize the objections to neoclassicism because they come from so many directions. As it is the primary school of thought in economics, every other one feels an obligation to outline what they see as its shortcomings as part of the justification for their own existence. But a Marxist critique of neoclassicism would be very different from that of a post-Keynesian or Austrian one. A listing would therefore be pointless, not to mention confusing, given that those schools of thought haven't been explained yet. However, one point about which each would agree is that they feel blocked out of the conversation. As suggested above, neoclassicism is dominant in graduate programs, journal rankings, textbooks, conferences, and in policy circles. Those coming from alternative perspectives say that it is one thing for the mainstream to disagree with them, it is quite another to be prevented from participating. One general criticism from several schools of thought is directed at the a priori as-if method. How, they ask, is abstract reasoning and reflection more unbiased than observation, especially when one is free to pose it as if premises that are not intended to even approximate real-world behavior? In fact, the result might be just the opposite, since one lacks an anchor, like the real world. against which premises must be checked. The a priori as-if method can lead to situations in which the researcher is creating premises, consciously or not, designed to support a preconceived conclusion, like full employment or market efficiency. Of course, neoclassicals say that they do compare their models to the real world, but only in terms of predictions. It does not matter how unrealistic the assumptions are, they argue, as long as the theory generates accurate forecasts. Critics respond, however, that while this might be a defensible approach were it actually followed, it is not. Neoclassical research almost never does this, preferring instead abstract mathematical modeling as sufficiently persuasive. In reality, there is no systematic process by which these are vetted, and so methods that claim to be designed to prevent uncontrolled speculation are actually generating exactly that, but with a veneer of respectability created by pretentious mathematical symbols. Final rejoinder. In every chapter I have criticisms of the school of thought, but then that school of thought gets to have the last word. It should first be pointed out that neoclassical economists are not necessarily aware of these criticisms. To be so would require that there is more communication between them and other schools of thought than actually exists. And as the main paradigm, they don't feel the need to engage other approaches. That said, the most obvious response is that if their approach were not superior, it would not be the mainstream. Indeed, as indicated at the beginning of this chapter, they dominate every aspect of the discipline, from all levels of education through policy. In the marketplace of ideas, they see themselves as having outcompeted everyone else. That others claim that their perspective is being suppressed is simply petulance. If you have a better idea, they argue, then let us hear it. We all have the same goal, to better understand the economy. The fact that neoclassicism is at the top should be sufficient evidence that abstract mathematical modeling based on axiomatic assumptions and the as-if method are extremely effective. And then the very last section in this chapter, further reading. Suggesting further reading for those interested in knowing more about neoclassicism is a bit difficult, since this school of thought is so large and has such a wide variety of sub-areas. In addition, because they are the dominant paradigm, those writing from this perspective are unlikely to identify themselves as neoclassicals and write simply as economists. Because of this, it would be generally safe to assume that unless otherwise stated, a given publication comes from this perspective. More specifically, just about any textbook on the market today is written from a neoclassical perspective. This includes not just micro and macroeconomics, but labor, international trade, game theory, exchange rates, development, economic history, public finance, money and banking, and so on. In addition, economic commentators, even if they appear to strongly disagree with one another, are almost exclusively neoclassical. See, for example, the blogs authored by Paul Krugman, Greg Mankiw, and Robert Reich. That these encompass what would generally be categorized as both liberal and conservative viewpoints is a testament to the range of neoclassicism, but they are nevertheless drawing from the same set of basic tools and analyses to understand the economy. Also worth investigating is the popular Freakonomics book by Stephen Levitt and Stephen Dubner, which applies basic neoclassical concepts to erstwhile non-economics topics. A similar book that was actually published much earlier was Stephen Landsberg's The Armchair Economist. Tim Harford's The Undercover Economist, and Charles Whelan and Burton Malkiel's Naked Economics also represent easy-to-read applications and explanations of neoclassical economics. Next chapter will be Marxism. May the force be with you.